Hi, everyone. Is this thing working? Can everyone hear me all right? So I've been working at Voltface doing a project called High Stakes for about the last 18 months, which is an inquiry into the drugs crisis in British prisons. And I've spent a lot of time talking to prisoners, prison staff, policymakers, politicians, and the wider community about the issues in our prisons and the appalling effect they're having on our criminal justice system and wider society. And a lot of the themes that I've spoken to people about are thankfully themes that have been picked up today. The Society tent opened this morning with Alex, who's here, and John, who were both talking about themes of loneliness. And also John was particularly talking about environments which can foster change and help people build their lives. Loneliness is really the key issue in our prisons at the moment, and people don't really care about prisoners, so talking about lonely prisoners is not an easy issue to deal with. But loneliness is very deep-seated in our very underfunded prisons where people are left on their own for 23 hours a day often. And it's loneliness that is at the core of a lot of people's drug addiction. It's not the drugs themselves that are necessarily the problem, but the fact that they are so lacking in connection that they develop a problematic connection with a substance that gives them some hope or some alleviation of their boredom, some respite from their pain. So we take people who've done terrible things, we lock them away, deprive them of social connection and purposeful activity, and expect them to become better people, and unsurprisingly it doesn't work. Most people reoffend within 12 months, and in some of our worst prisons it's up to 18% of men who didn't have a drug problem entering prison will leave with a drug addiction. 1 in 3 prisoners in our prisons admits to using spice during their incarceration. That's those who admit it. I would say that the number is more like 65-70% of prisoners using incredibly dangerous drugs whilst they're in prison. This is a huge market for organised criminals because we continue to put more and more people in prison. So we have almost 90,000 people in prison spending up to £50 for a hit of a very dangerous drug, and that's just funding criminals who are in there. So we're locking up drug dealers and putting them in lucrative markets for them to sell more drugs. And prison policy is failing for the same reason that drug policy is failing. And I think this is something that's quite important to address, and it's not listening to the people with the lived experience. There has been a serious lack of engagement with prisoners. Journalists are being closed out of prisons. Tightened budgets is making it harder and harder for communities to get involved in prisons. And what we're seeing is less and less understanding of what's going on within them from the public. And it's important to make sure that we are talking to them. The prevailing dogma refuses to recognize personal experience, the reality of market forces, and the social roots of addiction. The narrative that's normally discussed in conservative circles regarding prisons and drugs is a security issue. It's not a security issue. We know how to try and keep prisons secure, and people try their best to keep them secure. But in doing so, they create environments which try and close off entry into prisons in order to stop the supply of drugs into them. But in doing so, they further deprive people of social involvement and purposeful activity. And what that does is drive up the demand for drugs, which increases the size of the market and means that those dealing drugs within our prisons have even more incentive to supply drugs and even higher profits when doing so. So that improves the opportunities for corrupting staff and then cutting staff numbers continually, which we're now trying to change, but it's so difficult having lost nearly all the talent in our prison service. It's not happening at the moment. So you're getting less and less staff trying to deal with corruption and drug supply, and it's just not working. So conservatives have a strong belief in self-reliance and personal responsibility, which is a big part of conservative identity. And yet our prisons, which should be places to reform character, have become places that deliberately and systemically infantilize people and make those people devoid of purposeful activity in overcrowded and understaffed prisons with these obsessions over ineffective forms of security, which just leaves them as kind of brutal warehouses where people are being left to their own devices just to use and sell drugs. So thankfully we had an agenda for prison reform, and David Cameron came out and spoke about the poorest in our society while he was Prime Minister, and there was an agenda for change. And now, sadly, that seems to have been lost. We don't have the numbers to get the prison reform bill through, and there seems to be a lack of political will to address issues which affect the most vulnerable people in our society. And it's the same people who are moving between insecure housing, homelessness, and often prison. And it's the same thing that's come up in a number of discussions all over the place about just dealing with people at that end point where things have got so bad that you need to imprison someone at great expense, rather than trying to tackle the issues of loneliness, isolation, lack of engagement, inability to develop any capital in our society. So this has really been exacerbated lately in our prisons by the evolution of drug markets. Things like the dark web are being used in order to get a supply of new drugs, and organic chemists over the last 10 years have greatly accelerated the rate at which new drugs are discovered. These drugs can quickly be brought to market by unscrupulous entrepreneurs and very easily evade traditional security methods because we can't detect these substances. Often the drugs that prisoners are using, no one in that prison will have ever heard of that substance. No one has any idea what the long-term effects are, and we have no systems in place to detect those drugs. The drugs can be soaked into pieces of paper or other such really difficult to detect methods. So it's creating a real challenge, yet we're using the same old policies to deal with a very new evolution in the market, which is not going to help, unfortunately. And I think what was sad about the cuts we've seen across all public services really presented an opportunity to try and redefine the role of services, something I would have liked to have seen be done. Instead, what we did was cut prison budgets by too deep and too fast without addressing the demand on the system. In fact, exacerbating the demand on the system, because we also had cuts across all other services that then lead to a greater demand on our prison service. And instead of looking at which people we want to be in prison, is it people who are experiencing issues of homelessness and addiction who are stealing to support a miserable lifestyle, or is it the really worst in society who we think cannot be contained within society? And we really need to take the opportunity to, as a community, redefine what it is we want to be doing with our prisons. I think there are real opportunities for a pragmatic government to embrace better drug policy, and focus on making prison a place of last resort where the people who want to turn their lives around, which is most people, really, I genuinely think that most people in prison do not want to be bad people. There are psychopaths and there are ruthless people, but they are the very, very few. I'd go so far as to say only a few thousand in our prisons at the moment. What we really need to do is focus on the demand issue and realize that prisons are a place where people need to be given the opportunity to make positive relationships in their life. Relationships with people, with jobs, with communities, and that has to happen within a prison. It can't just be a cell in which you're kept. It has to be a place where you speak to people on a daily basis, where you start to become more competent at dealing with your emotions and not resorting to the use of drugs. At the core of this kind of failed prison policy and failed drug policy is an idea that there's salvation in punishment, an idea that punishing people with addiction and crime problems will help, will reduce crime. It's proven not to work. We also overuse prison because we think it will help reduce the pain of victims, and I don't think that works. And I think there are really good community options that we need to start exploring that much better help victims work through the emotions of being a victim of crime. criminal justice policy is just about the most irrational policy area in our country. If we're going to move towards more effective and cheaper policies, we need to restore faith in experts, because there is a broad consensus among prison service and criminologists about what needs to be done. It just doesn't match with the public perception of what needs to be done, and that's because we continue to hide this issue away, lock people in boxes, keep them out of sight, and then people don't understand how prisons work and what they are. The groups who work closely with prisoners and listen to their concerns are invaluable, not only because they provide support networks to help people rebuild their lives, but because they're an early warning system. These people knew about the spice crisis, novel psychoactive substances in our prisons, back in 2011, 2012. Nobody listened. The media didn't pick up on it, drug testing systems didn't pick up on it, politicians didn't pick up on it, and it reached a crisis point before anything happened. Now, if we're going to build in effective policy, we need to embrace these early indicators, find the people who spot problems in our prison, and make sure they're involved in policy formation. As David Cameron said, somewhat hollowly, but with good logic, our economy can't be secure if we spend billions of pounds on picking up the pieces of social failure, and our society can't be strong and cohesive as long as there are millions of people who feel locked out of it. So economic reform and social reform are not two separate agendas, but they are intimately connected to one another. So we face a real vast but achievable task here of building communities which protect themselves from the harms of drug abuse and help defend themselves from ruthless criminals who want to profit from people's misery. And it really is a vast task, but it is achievable. And you need to see prisons as communities, not just as communities in themselves, but as part of the communities in which they sit. I've spoken to politicians up and down the country, and the amount who've never even been to a prison is astounding. These places cost a fortune. They're where we hold the most dangerous people in our society. They're where people are being radicalized, where drug dealers learn their trade, where people learn how to commit horrible crimes that make our society unsafe. And they're incredibly important. They're not places to be shunned and ignored. You've probably heard about the prison crisis innumerable times, but rarely does that lead to a kind of galvanized call for action. And I think that's because the stories within prisons don't get out. We need to open up prisons to politicians, journalists, local communities, businesses, as places where we should be actively engaging. An obsession over trying to eradicate the supply of drugs into prisons is preventing this from happening. I'm not saying we shouldn't try and keep drugs out of prisons, but that is not the main issue here. The main issue is why people are using horrible drugs that make them feel terrible and kill them in large numbers, and that's because of the environment in which they're living. So we need to do something in prisons that's going to dramatically reduce the demand for drugs, and in order to do that, we need to alleviate the overcrowding, and that means, unfortunately, that we have to send less people to prison. We simply can't afford to do it, and our prisons do not work. They are incredibly dysfunctional. So we need to have a conversation about who it is we want to be in prison, and what we want to do with people who commit crimes, but we don't think that they're bad enough for them to go to prison. And that needs to be a much wider public conversation. So, yeah. That's what I'm here to talk about. Yep, Francis.
Thanks for such.
Do you need this?
Oh yeah, do I?
This is fair, Mike.
Oh, is it? Okay. I'll let you keep saying it. Thanks. Thanks for such clear and insightful analysis on this. I just wanted to ask: is there any country in the world that's doing this well? Because I think most people who sort of read about this or are watching documentaries, it seems that prisons around the world are generally pretty grim and pretty bad. Is there anywhere that actually, on this issue particularly, is doing it right in your view?
Yeah, there are two. One which I've had the opportunity to visit and one which I've not. The Netherlands has a problem with prisons, and their problem is that they've got no one to put in them. They've had to start renting them out to their neighbours. They've got loads of prisons, nobody to put in them because they've started to implement really effective problem-solving courts and community sanctions. So the Netherlands now rents out its prisons to its neighbours and makes money out of them. I think that's fantastic. But I haven't been to the Netherlands to visit those prisons. The ones that I have been to visit are in Norway. Now, Norway has a very expensive prison system. They have very expensive everything. But within their prisons, what I found most amazing and great was that there wasn't a complete it wasn't that they were drug free, this kind of idealistic haven. There were drugs in prisons in Norway, but the only way in which they were supplied was through social supply. So it's a bit graphic and unpleasant, but the way in which people brought them in was plugging, so secreting them, you know, where the sun doesn't shine, and bringing them into the prison and sharing them amongst other drug users. Now, no one in Norwegian prisons can sell drugs because they have dynamic security in place, which means there are always prison officers or drug treatment staff or businesses there. There are always people with the prisoners. And that means that they would spot who was selling drugs. And if that person was selling drugs, they would be moved to a different prison. And when they arrived at the new prison, someone would say, that guy was selling drugs at the last prison. Keep an eye on him. We don't keep an eye on people in prison. We're obsessed with making sure nothing gets into the prison. And then once you're in the prison, it's carnage. Everybody just does what they want. So you got this attempt to keep drugs out that actually ends up making sure way more drugs get in. So Norway does it well. It's not cheap, and the only way you can pay for it is sending less people to prison. They've only got a prison population of about 4,500, which is the same as we've got women in prison, which is crazy because we've got hardly any women that ought to be in prison. They're nearly all there because of kind of social problems rather than being a danger to society.
And the other country?
Netherlands and Norway. They're the two.
Right. Sorry, forgive me.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Roger, sorry.
Thanks, great presentation. Apart from the state-owned organisation, are there any other organisations, charities, who are doing particularly well to help alleviate some of the problems you've highlighted? And if so, what would you like to do to sort of scale them up or do differently?
Thank you. That's a good question, Roger. I think one of the most important organisations that I'd like to highlight who aren't here today are an organisation called User Voice. They're run by a chap who used to be homeless in the area around our think tank in Soho, and he used to deal a small amount of drugs and go in and out of prison and backwards and forwards, and he set up they're called peer councils in the prisons, and basically what they are is an opportunity for the prisoners to come together, discuss issues, vote on them, and then present practical changes to the prison governance. They do surveys of all their prisoners, which helps pick up on issues. They were the first people to realise about the spice crisis. They provide a network for people upon release. That might mean that someone's got a sofa to sleep on, which might be the difference between them burgling a house the night they get out of a prison or sticking around and making that first week, which is so traumatic for prisoners when they leave. So those kind of peer support groups are fantastic. We also have a number of drug treatment groups like RAPT who are doing great work in prisons. There are examples out there, and a lot of them are scalable. Yeah, you're keen, sorry.
Thanks, it's Andrew Adonis. That's a brilliant presentation and very important work that you're doing. But the more I listen to you and what you said about Denmark and the Netherlands, the clearer it came to me that the problem which we face isn't prison reform, it's sentencing reform.
Yeah.
If we could cut sentences dramatically, both the number going to prison and the length of time that they go to prison, then we would have all of the space to do the things that you're talking about, and we wouldn't be in such a big business of essentially managing cattle markets because they're so overcrowded. And that figure of 4,500 in the Netherlands, which is at least as safe a society, in some ways safer than ours, is very salutary. Now, don't we have to face the fact that the biggest obstacle to sentencing reform up till now has been the Conservative Party? It was Michael Howard's Home Secretaryship which began this massive bidding up of prison sentences in league with the Daily Mail, which I much regret the government of which I was a part maintained. We didn't make it worse. Well, we did make it worse in some respects. The indeterminate sentences was an absolute scandal. But by and large, what we did, because we were so afraid of the Daily Mail as well, and also the Conservative Party, the backlash that there would be, that we simply maintained it. But what hasn't happened since 2010 is, despite the tinkering with prison reform and some nice speeches by Michael Gove about extending the academy model to prisons, nothing at all has happened on sentencing.
Yeah.
And until somebody takes a radical axe to the current policy on sentencing, we will never get a handle on prison reform, and we will go from bad to worse in terms of the criminal justice system in the country.
I completely agree. I'd go a little bit further to say that it's a dual problem, and one prong is housing, which Sam Bowman made some really interesting suggestions on. And as long as you have hundreds of thousands of people in insecure housing and homeless, then you're going to have a big demand on your prison system. So that's a big issue. But sentencing reform is key, and I personally I think it would be the best thing that this country could do for our criminal justice system is to remove all sentences under a year and stop recalling people to prison for short sentences. It costs a fortune. You spend most of the cost of putting someone in prison up front, and it's proven that you can only rehabilitate people in the long term, a year or longer. So sending people to prison for a short amount of time is almost certain to make them worse. But problem is that the public perception is that prison works, and we know that it's an old mantra that goes around, and Labour made great gains under Tony Blair by just constantly adding to criminal statutes with new offences and constantly saying that sentences would get longer, and that does win votes sometimes. But I think there are a lot of things that we could do in the background. Was there the strength of will within government, within the civil service, to do things that don't attract big headlines, not come out and do something huge, but fiddle around with the details in a way that will show gains that you can then show back to the public once they've noticed what you're doing. You have to kind of do some of it in the background and then prove its effectiveness. Actually, the Centre for Social Justice had some good suggestions on this in a recent report they did about bringing the judiciary better into the whole sentencing process and getting them involved in sentence management and having a judicial oversight of recalling people back to prison. One of the biggest problems we've got at the moment with the homeless community moving in and out of prison is people deliberately being returned to prison and then supplying drugs upon their return, and they get recalled and sent to prison without a judicial act. That's an automatic process. And if we could have judicial oversight of that, so we weren't just sending people back from breaking into a car window to go back and do another 6 months in prison, that would be a great gain. There are lots and lots of these kind of small, not sexy, not very exciting policy changes that just need attention to detail that could reduce our prison population by 5, 6, 7,000, which would probably be enough to get it out of crisis and back into a place where you can start to manage it and start to make greater reforms. But I'd like to see really extensive sentencing reform. I think it's the last question if anyone's got one. One more? No. Oh.
I haven't got much experience of prisons, but I've got a lot of experience of addiction in my family. And what you were saying earlier about the fact you're talking about, it's not really about the drugs, it's to do with you're going to be like that no matter what. And what Alex was saying this morning as well, like it's all about relationships, like we're social animals. And if someone, for whatever reason, goes into adulthood not having the ability to have proper relationships with whatever it is, it's going to manifest itself, and it's all linked. Do we need to really step back and look at our kind of education system and and that's why I think as a Conservative actually we're really proud of our values around family and around community, because that helps prevent all of these problems. Do we need to look at our education system, both in the when people are in prison, but also from childhood?
Yeah.
As how do we prevent people going into adulthood with these issues?
Our drug education is a total shambles. Most of the UK completely misunderstands the nature of addiction. They're scared of drugs and think that by using them you're likely to turn into an addict, which we know isn't the case. That's not how addiction works. And unfortunately at the moment the Conservative Party aligns itself with charities who push a chemical, brain chemistry model of addiction, which is totally unhelpful, telling people that certain people have addictive personalities and that's why they can't do drugs is misguided and unhelpful, and telling kids that the key to not becoming an addict is to abstain from ever trying drugs is equally misguided. Children aren't stupid. They see people use drugs, have fun, and they see people use drugs and then go down the wrong path and into addiction, and they know both courses can happen, and people always back themselves and think, oh, I'll be fine. So if you told someone don't do drugs or you'll end up being an addict, and then they watch and that's not their lived experience, they will ignore all the rest of your messaging around drugs. We really need to be bold with teaching children about addiction, how addiction for young people now is mostly to do with social media and not drugs, and they don't understand it and they don't recognize it when it's happening to themselves or their friends. We need to teach education at schools and realize that opening this issue up is not going to increase addiction. It's not like a scary thing that we should be hiding from them to protect their innocence. It's something about being a resilient person that needs to be taught and understood. And at the moment, we did some recent work on drug education in schools. Most kids get an hour a year and it's being talked at. And we've got a lot of evidence to suggest that simply doesn't work. There needs to be interactive sessions where children and young people can ask questions and get involved and learn in a collaborative way with their peers and about addiction. And to be honest, interestingly, young people are using less and less drugs. So addiction from when I was at school, drugs were the big thing. There was a huge problem with the rates of drug use among young people. Now, like I said, addiction is more to do with social media and technology. So we need to adapt to that and teach about addiction, relationships, connection, not just substances. All right, one more, and then I'm going to definitely have to stop.
We've got a strong view also around, to your point, education in terms of developing skill sets for prisoners and offenders so that, you know, there's something to create a life for afterwards. And it feels to me that there's an enormous amount of work that could be done in that regard too. What's your thoughts on that?
Sorry, what's my thoughts on what could be done?
Developing skill sets for offenders within prisons.
Yeah,
great
I
opportunities.
I definitely think there's huge opportunities here, but I would caution, because I was in, for instance, Pentonville prison, which has been the subject of a lot of attention recently, what with the murder and the escapes and everything else that's going on there. And I've seen the way in which we've tried to encourage skills for prisoners in that prison is actually having a very detrimental effect, because we're looking to pay for the voluntary sector on performance, which I like, but unfortunately Gove's big push was for skills, job skills, literacy, numeracy, which are important, but now you've got prisons where they're taking people who are withdrawing from heroin, cold shakes, shivers, being sick, and herding them into courses to learn how to read and write, and those people are not ready for skills, unfortunately, and a lot of the people I've seen in prison are unfortunately not ready to learn skills. They need to learn really basic stuff, not job skills, but life skills.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's not enough focus on that. So I could totally agree with that. We need to find where people are and deal with that, not just try and make sure that they're literate or they've got good numeracy skills, but work with where they are.
I think that's our view, is that's a whole set of skills. So there might be, some people might be good at academic stuff, and great, we can help with that. But then there is an awful lot around life skills, and a reoffending rate's over 50%. Something needs to be done to help people.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot of attention in the press as a crisis, but I'm quite surprised how little that's translated into elevating this on the political agenda. We're spending billions of pounds on making people worse and our society more dangerous. It's a real disaster at the moment.
And it doesn't necessarily even need to be cerebral skills. It could be sports. It could be athletics. It's just helping people find something that excites them and to create a life for the future.
I completely agree. That's exactly what we need to do. All right, and on that note, I think that's us done for time. Thank you for coming.